Just like a film, and also kind of like a child, a TV series has many parents. That is, people around or inside the show's orbit that make it as great as it desires to be. Sometimes it's the side characters, the peripheral parents that contribute greatest to a show's overall satiation. One such character that I appreciate greatly and I find severely underranked is little Carmine Lupertazzi. I can appreciate that your time is less than limited, so I'll clip the bit and cut to the chase. Little Carmine has been described as the dumbest character on The Sopranos. If you're a diehard fan of the show, you'll find that easy to agree with. With his knack for wet t-shirt contests, lack of business acumen, and constant malapropisms, Carmine makes Fredo Corleone look like someone deserving of respect. Despite all that, I believe I can show how Carmine is actually the wisest wise guy in The Sopranos. But until I do, it's going to be hard to verify that I think I can. So here goes. Little Carmine comes from a royal mafia lineage. His father is Carmine Lupertazzi Sr., the boss of the New York family. Unlike his progeny, Big Carmine is a very allegorical guy, a man with a colossal reputation built on a foundation of traits and skills that must skip a generation. He was a self-made man who rose to the pinnacle of mob life. Among those aforementioned skills is negotiation. His prowess in that arena drives a wedge in his relationship with Tony Soprano when they clash over a business dispute late in Season 4. We first meet little Carmine in the Season 4 episode Calling All Cars, when Tony flies down to Miami to seek his advice on the dispute and go about finding a resolution. In his very first scene, Carmine tells Tony a historical anecdote, the story of Louis, the whatever's finance minister, does something. He built a palace that outshone Versailles, and in the end, Louis clapped him in irons. The relevance of this tale is lost on Tony because it doesn't really seem to have any in the context of the scene. However, it indirectly highlights Carmine's clandestine intelligence. This is a true story, one that Carmine characteristically butchers. I recognized it instantly from Robert Greene's book, The 48 Laws of Power. This is a very well-known book, and it was published in 1998, so it's very possible that the writers read the book and lifted the story from Greene's pages, implying that Carmine had read the book himself. It's actually the very first historical anecdote in a book containing hundreds, written under the heading of the first law, which is, never outshine the master. The Louis Carmine references is Louis XIV, the Sun King. His finance minister, Nicolas Fouquet, although highly competent, was something of a hedonist who valued the company of women and excessive partying nearly as much as he valued money. Fouquet's constant courting of attention drew Louis's ire. The king desired a monopoly on attention and a tax on validation. He was the sun that all of France orbited around, so naturally, he felt threatened by Fouquet's eclipse. Feeling the tension in his relationship with the king, Fouquet sought to ingratiate himself with Louis. Knowing the king as a fellow lover of extravagance, his plan was to throw the most lavish party the world had ever seen in his brand new chateau, honoring the king as his guest of honor. The plan backfired, and Louis had his finance minister arrested the very next day. He would be exiled to a faraway prison where he spent the remainder of his life in solitary confinement. Louis would later have the Palace of Versailles built to outshine the magnificence of Fouquet's chateau. Instead of flattering the king, Fouquet incited his insecurity, which ultimately cost him his freedom and his life. This story is very allegorical. When you're wearing the crown, you can shine as brightly as you wish. However, if you find yourself below the top rung, neglecting to dim your shine can bear grave consequences. Carmine may not have been able to articulate the particulars of the story, but this is a chunk of wisdom he has integrated into his mind. He was reminded of the story when discussing Johnny Sack, his father's underboss. Now, Johnny wasn't throwing any lavish soirees or building any chateaus, but at that point in the narrative, he was beginning to chafe under Big Carmine's leadership. The two come to blows when Big Carmine declines to sanction a hit on Ralph for a joke. The chafing is only further irritated when Carmine opts for the nuclear option in his business skirmish with Tony, shutting down the Esplanade construction site. The Esplanade accounted for only a small slice of Carmine's income, yet it turned off the faucet for one of Tony and Johnny Sack's major revenue streams. Johnny's accruing frustration with Carmine reaches a breaking point, and he ties his hunger for retribution and power to a sticking post, secretly meeting with Tony to arrange for Carmine's disappearance. But how does this relate to little Carmine's dormant intelligence? He sees beyond the benevolent underboss facade of Johnny Sack. He tells Tony as much in their first meeting. He's a pragmatist and a greedy Oedipus. Johnny may not have necessarily outshone Big Carmine in the way Fouquet did the Sun King, but he undoubtedly overstepped his boundaries with the master. Driven by emotion, John pleaded to Carmine to have Ralph killed over a joke, a whacking that would have put a severe dent in their coffers and in the pockets of all of their associates. Johnny would have upset the apple cart purely out of emotion, and that made Big Carmine feel insecure and uncomfortable. So much so that he calls Tony soon after and arranges for Johnny to be whacked. It's only after sharing a tender moment with his wife that Johnny comes to his senses and calls off a hit he put on Ralph, an unsanctioned action that would have seen him far worse than clapped in irons. His demise is delayed. Johnny Sack's hunger to be the boss of the family is apparent to the audience, Tony, and both Carmines. It's an ambition that's shared by Johnny and little Carmine. What makes little Carmine the wiser of the two parties is his patience, his inclination to sit back and hang out in a different state, and his biding for time until he makes his move. He stays out of the spotlight, where his errors and naivete cannot be exposed. There's no danger of outshining the master when there's distance between you. Little Carmine, it must be noted, had the benefit of the cushy position of being the boss's son. He didn't have to be out in the streets earning his bones the same way Johnny Sack does. But that's not to say that he's entirely uninvolved in the business. Despite bearing the reputation of being the incompetent son, he seems to be doing some work behind the scenes. Big Carmine cites him as being a big help in ultimately solving the Esplanade dispute. Whether this is true or not is unknown. What is known is that little Carmine, despite his rep, isn't burdened to prove his merit. He's content to have others like Johnny underestimate him, a tactic that can allow him to blindside his enemies with a sudden, bold move, a tactic that often proves useful in the game of power. Little Carmine's moment comes when his father passes away on the golf course in Season 5. Carmine's desire to succeed his father as boss of the family is clear, as is Johnny Sack's. That sets the two men on a collision course that results in a bloody war. Carmine's ambitions to succeed his father are dimmed by the war's escalating body count. Reflecting in front of a fireplace, swirling a glass of cognac, he questions whether the juice is worth the mortal squeeze. Ultimately, unfazed by his power-mongering advisor Rusty, Carmine decides to step away, paving Johnny Sack's path to the crown. It's a bit of a head-scratcher. Carmine had already sunk much cost into the battle, and a strong case could be made that it was his hereditary right. Carmine himself provides some clarity on his perspective at the time in a Season 6 scene with Tony. This comes following Johnny Sack's incarceration. Another power vacuum had opened up in the New York family, and with it came an anxiety-inducing degree of bloodshed and instability. The violence spills onto Tony's doorstep as Silvio was nearly made collateral damage during a New York hit. Tony meets with Carmine to persuade him to revive his prior ambitions. Tony wants a swift conclusion to the conflict, one that preferably doesn't end with Phil on top given their turbulent relationship at this point in the narrative. Carmine promptly shuts that door. He confides in Tony about a revelatory dream he had. The dream begins with his father, at a big celebration commemorating his 100th birthday. Big Carmine wears a paper crown from a fast food joint. Little Carmine gives him a magnificent box. His father opens it and gazes back at him with absolute disappointment. It's empty inside. "Go fill it up," he says to him. "Come back when I'm 200. Tony's immediate interpretation is misguided. He believes it indicates little Carmine's dormant desire to become boss. Or perhaps he's using it as a manipulation tactic. Anyways, Carmine sets him straight with his own interpretation. The dream was about being happy, he tells him. The timing of the dream is key. It came during the Johnny Sack War. It was a message from the deep urging Carmine to step aside for the sake of his family and to ensure he could safely enjoy the rest of his life with them. A conclusion that was buttressed by wise words from his wife. "I don't want to be the wealthiest widow on Long Island," she told him. I want you to quit. This decision and the intelligence and self-awareness it reveals is what makes Carmine the wisest character in The Sopranos. He is really the only character who makes it through the finale without getting clipped and without a dark cloud looming over his head. The paper crown is a very interesting dream symbol. It seems to be a play on the phrase, "heavy is the head that holds the crown." The luster and allure of a crown makes it coveted by all, but it invariably brings negative consequences, envious subordinates, supreme accountability, and an avalanche of new pressures and responsibilities, both expected and unforeseen. Every decision affects every facet of everything. The heaviness of a crown is well known and often lamented by Tony. Gandolfini in this scene subtly communicates a degree of jealousy toward Carmine for the comfortable position he set himself in. The weight of the crown is further emphasized by the contrast between Tony and Carmine in this scene. From the jump, Tony's irritated, and a general vibe of frustration colors his face and animates his body. Carmine, on the other hand, is light and buoyant, without a care in the world, it seems. Tony's on the phone placing bets when the scene begins and orders a Philly cheesesteak. Carmine breezes off of his golf cart and orders ahi tuna with mixed greens. Tony is concerned solely with instant gratification, gorging himself on whatever fleeting pleasures are immediately available to him to find some relief from the constant pressures he faces. Carmine is concerned with his health and with preserving his longevity. Every moment is inherently enjoyable when there isn't a sword dangling over your head. In the end, Carmine loses the Battle of New York to Johnny Sack, but wins the War of Life, specifically the mob life. Johnny Sack successfully fulfilled his life's greatest ambitions, but his reign was painfully brief. We all know what the price of becoming the boss was. It cost Johnny his freedom, eventually his life, and precious time with his family, which he always held in the highest regard and frankly should have valued over his status. It's a fate that Carmine shrewdly avoids. Carmine's character arc is incredibly unique in the criminal world of The Sopranos. He's the only mafioso who recognizes the unsustainable nature of this thing of theirs and proactively makes a change for the better. He also understands the immense dividends paid out to his professional and personal life by subtracting such stresses. However, it should be noted that Carmine is also unique in that he's one of the only characters in the series with the financial flexibility and hereditary status to be able to make that change in the first place. Someone like Eugene Pontecorvo, for instance, was glued to the lifestyle by virtue of being a made guy and an earner, and was unable to change for the better despite his desire to do so. In the end, Carmine was perhaps the only recurring character in the series who recognized the value of trading a real crown for a paper crown. That recognition and his seamless execution, in my estimation, solidifies his status as The Sopranos' wisest character.